Scott had built this team. It was this really important piece in Dropbox's growth from about 200 million to I think like 1.6 billion in ARR. He found over and over again, so many strategic decisions were just gated on the billing system. Everything from new product launches to acquiring another company to expanding internationally. Like I remember one kind of like memorable example, we wanted to expand into Japan. That was the largest free user base for Dropbox outside of North America. And we found that all of the pricing in our billing system was hard-coded, which then actually ended up delaying the Japanese launch until we had time to refactor the billing code.
So that was essentially like the insight to start Metronome. Welcome to the PO, where we explore the world's greatest startup stories. I'm your host, Turner Novak, founder of Banana Capital, the only venture capital firm with usage-based management fees. I'm excited to share my conversation with Kevin Liu, co-founder and CEO of Metronome, which enables software companies to launch, iterate, and scale their business models with billing infrastructure that works at any size and stage. Kevin talks through the lessons learned building and selling his first company to Dropbox, his framework for iterating on new startup ideas, how he leveraged angels to raise Metronome's seed and Series A rounds, the dangers of overbuilding a product, scaling Metronome along hypergrowth AI customers like OpenAI and NVIDIA, his tactics for how busy founders should prioritize their time, and a crash course on software pricing. Kevin is a wealth of startup knowledge and has a great story packed with actionable advice for anyone building a startup. And a big thank you to Dimitri at Modern Treasury for connecting us. Before we jump in, a quick shout out for Artie, one of my latest investments at Banana. Artie is a real-time database replication solution that uses change data capture and streaming technology to sync your databases and data warehouse in real time. Most companies still use batched ETLs to transfer data to their data warehouse, which means that analysts only have access to stale data. Artie gives you live production data in your data warehouse, enabling you to generate real-time insights and operationalize your data. For example, fintech companies use Artie for transaction monitoring, internal risk analysis, and to offer customer-facing analytics dashboards. Artie abstracts away all the complexity of setting up and managing a streaming architecture. And their advanced analytics portal gives you insights into system-level infrastructure and helps monitor your database and pipeline health. If you want to set up streaming connectors in minutes that require zero maintenance day-to-day, visit the link in the show notes and sign up for a demo. You can also go to artie.so/banana. That's ARTIE.so/banana. Thank you, Artie. And now let's talk to Kevin at Metronome. Kevin, how's it going?
Good to meet you finally.
Yeah, good to meet you too. Thanks for coming on. So the first question, could you just explain to us really quick, what is Metronome, the product?
Really quick is the hard part of this, honestly. There are a lot of components to the product because we're pretty broadly spread out across a lot of different use cases within a company. But I think the short version I would think about is that Metronome is the leading billing platform for modern software companies. So our mission is really to help companies operationalize and accelerate their revenue. And I think it's worth noting because I don't think accelerating revenue is really something you typically associate with a billing system of all things. Maybe something I think typically more akin to like automation, but we try to think about everything we build through the lens of how we can actually help companies move faster and grow their business. To get more specific with it, our initial insight was really focused on helping customers with the transition to usage-based pricing models, first by building this billing platform that was real-time and data first. So that's still very much the case today, although we've broadened out. Most of our customers also have, subscription and one-time fees as a part of their pricing and packaging. But the product today actually really has like three different areas of focus, I would say. So there's data, there's billing, and there's revenue. On the data side of things, we look more akin to an infrastructure company, right? So if you think about how a company will do billing, especially when they have more complex pricing models, there's this data component that requires you to understand what the customer is doing inside of your product. And so we integrate directly with your event streams to actually ingest that information and to calculate metrics in real time. And we make sure that that data, along with the billing data that's in Metronome, gets to other use cases within your company. Unlike most billing systems, which are these like batch-based architectures, we're built on modern data streaming technology. So your customers and your teams always know what's happening with how customers are using your product and how that's turning into dollars. You don't have to wait until end of month to understand consumption or to make decisions. The billing part of it is really like this incredibly complex like business logic platform, right? So you can think of it as like first component, the usage data streams in, We're performing all of these aggregations on top of it. It hits kind of like the billing side of things. And now our job is to encode all of the terms of the financial agreement between you and your customers. So maybe that's a fully automated self-serve motion where a customer can just like swipe a credit card. But beyond just the typical pricing you want to offer, you also want to experiment. So there's a bunch of variants of that. Maybe there's a large enterprise customer that's negotiated custom discounts and strange rollover terms in a bespoke commit or some kind of weird minimum structure. Whatever it is, we have to be able to model that. And we have to keep it organized and consistent inside of Metronome. We need to be 100% accurate, right? Like there's no tolerance for error. You don't misbill customers. You really don't want that to happen.
Especially when like that's your revenue. Like this is how you're making money. If you're not billing correctly, that's your business model.
That's really the thing that's a little bit different. I think even on the data component, like we look almost similar, I think, in some respects to an observability company in that we have this like massive data pipeline, data streaming through it. We're calculating metrics. People will oftentimes like look at that and be like, that looks like observability or it looks like analytics. But the difference is you can drop some number of analytics events or observability events on the floor. And, you know, it's a little bit no harm, no foul. It's obviously not good. Like nobody wants a data pipeline that's lossy. But if you drop some percentage of your billing data on the floor, that's a real problem, right? Like that's a P0 for us, a major incident. And so there's really just no tolerance for error when it comes to billing. So if you think about a billing platform, you're calculating how much a customer owes on an invoice. That's kind of like the core billing piece of it. But we actually have these two other parts that we really, really need to make great for customers. On the data side, we look more akin to an infrastructure company. We integrate directly with your event streams to calculate all of your metrics in real time so you don't have to. On the revenue side, we have this very, very complex set of integrations that we have to run through to complete that end-to-end story for customers post-billing through collections, through reconciliation, through revenue recognition. And that's oftentimes especially complex because you have to jump from the constraints of all these different systems to get to a working end-to-end financial workflow. That kind of covers the whole end-to-end suite of things for us. We go through data, we go through billing, and then we're getting that data out to other systems so that you can use it for your business.
So then in terms of just the history of the software market, obviously we didn't start with usage-based billing, being able to measure every single detail of like how a customer used the product. It was like licenses, subscription, and now we got to usage-based. Can you kind of talk us through just the history of how this is all played out?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it today is that we're really seeing kind of in SaaS pricing today what happens inevitably when any industry matures. Like if you look at how people have charged for video games or how cell phone providers have charged for their fees, right? Like as industries mature, the context changes and you really converge around new pricing and packaging. In the early days of SaaS pricing, I don't think the pricing back then was particularly nuanced. It was just flat rate subscriptions. Although that in and of itself was already this like leap forward from paying for a perpetual license. Basically like you pay once and you own the software forever and you literally deploy it on a server, right? Like this on-prem deployed software. So, I mean, that early SaaS pricing, that flat rate subscription really, I think was the first step in unlocking the ability for a company and a customer to maintain a long-term financial relationship with like a much smoother upgrade model, right? Like software is just deployed in the cloud, you get all the upgrades as they come. But that was really step one, right? Pricing doesn't live in a vacuum. And over time, it evolves in response to the market, what companies and customers are trying to solve for, as well as whatever competitive dynamics are out there. So companies and customers both kind of like push the bounds of pricing to solve for things that either party needs, right? Better value capture for the company, fairer pricing models for customers. And I think for usage in particular, that's being driven by a number of things. I think the first is there's just always this instinct to get to better alignment, kind of like fairer pricing models that's being driven by the customer. Vendors have to respond to that. And when you look at kind of like early SaaS pricing, or even like, I would actually call seats kind of like the first instantiation of a usage-based model, right? Like people don't necessarily think of them that way, but they're really just like a very coarse-grained metric for how companies are using your product.
It's like the most simple form of usage-based. Like, oh, one person's using it, 10 people are using it. That's how many seats you have.
And if you look at what happened with seats, you'll see that you kind of started with really, really coarse-grained, like, I'll agree to buy, 1,000 seats of Salesforce or 1,000 seats of whatever, company it is that you're committing to. And it kind of doesn't matter how many you actually use. And people kind of like responded to that and were like, well, why am I paying for, all of these seats when I'm not using them? And so then you kind of evolve to these like more dynamic models where people can kind of upsell and downsell throughout the month, depending on how many people are actually using the product, all the way to like, you go all the way to like Slack's like kind of fair billing, where like there are different classes of seats and there's more complex proration. It gets really complex, right? But that's really like a good example of how that spectrum plays out over time, and how, the customer really kind of like pushes companies to align to more quote unquote fair pricing models. Like even if you're not selling a direct competitor to Slack, a customer that's familiar with Slack's pricing model might come to you and be like, well, Slack charges this way, so like, why don't you? I would say the second thing is, as customers shift their software into the cloud, their COGS model just completely changes.
Can you explain COGS really quickly for somebody who's never heard that word before?
Yeah, COGS is just cost of goods sold. You can think of it like in very brief as kind of the cost that you pay to run your product. When you were deploying software on-prem, the customer would literally take on all of the COGS, all of the cost for running your product, right? It's running on their servers. You're not incurring any additional costs to kind of manage that product. But once it's in the cloud, that's shared infrastructure across all of your customers. So when a customer, let's say, sends a bunch of data into your product, makes a bunch of API requests, spins up a cluster, right? Like that costs you money now when you have cloud software. That's kind of like broadly speaking true. And what happens is companies have to, like, in the long run, be able to predict and hold a consistent good margin, right? Like the cost can't be more expensive than the money that you're taking in, especially when it comes to just kind of like baseline like infrastructure costs. And so what happens is when you've built on top of a cloud provider or another platform, all of these platforms are using consumption-based pricing models, right? Amazon charges you based off of how much of AWS you use. If your cost in the background is kind of like going like this, right? It's jumping up and down, it's going up and down, then you can't hold like a flat pricing structure if suddenly the cost spikes and the amount you're making is actually no longer tied to the cost of your product. And so that's when kind of consumption-based models that really are like maybe one or two layers abstracted away from Amazon's pricing come into play. You see a lot of infrastructure companies doing this, where they're really just kind of like value add, repackaging Amazon's pricing in different ways. And they're providing a lot of value on top of Amazon's infrastructure, but ultimately it's all running in Amazon's services, and they're getting charged for however much you're using of their product. So that's another, I think, really, really significant reason that we're seeing that happen. I would say the third is really product-led growth. So the macro trend we're seeing play out now is that the average company is seeing their pricing get a lot more complex over time, right? SaaS companies in the past would be either maybe like self-serve or enterprise, but not both. You would kind of be one or the other, right? But now you have these like product-led growth companies that try to connect both motions in a continuous funnel. Like you can sign up self-serve as a small account inside of a large organization, and then over time, you actually get to the point where you've grown enough that you now are talking to a salesperson and upselling, going into this enterprise motion, right?
So an example of that would be like an engineer from Walmart signs up and you say, oh, Walmart, they have a lot more needs than just this one person. That's kind of your way to get in the door at one of these larger customers that before you'd have to like go to the CTO, try to convince them to take a meeting, sell it top down.
That's exactly right. So you may have heard the term land and expand. That's really like highly applicable to companies that have this kind of product-led growth motion, right? And if you look at kind of historical companies that have done a really great job of this, I think Figma is really well understood to run a really good PLG motion. Segment is another one. There are a lot more. But basically, you're talking about situations where you're actually running two totally different go-to-market motions at the same time.
Yeah, they're
literally
very
double. It's literally double the complexity, and then you add in the complexity of trying to connect the two. What happens then is, product-led growth actually incentivizes you to make it really easy for people to adopt at the beginning of the funnel. So consumption is a really great fit for that, because if all you have to pay for is one seat, or you only have to pay for the number of API calls that you use, it's much easier for an individual developer to actually like sign up and start right away. And then as the account scales up over time, it actually just winds up naturally expanding because of the way that consumption-based pricing models work. But yeah, I mean, that complexity is just hard for companies to manage, right? Like it used to be that you would just charge someone like $1 million. They would take your software and deploy it on a server. And now we have like these subscription fees, and then we'll charge you for implementation. And then there are these add-ons, and this bit is consumption based. This part is, a quarterly subscription. This part has a minimum. So it makes for a very complex mix for companies to manage and operationalize.
And I think you've kind of mentioned a couple other things in the past, like it impacts how you do your accounting, how you compensate your salespeople. There's a lot of kind of downstream from just even like the revenue perspective of like changing from just, SaaS or subscription to usage based introduces a bunch more complexities. Can you kind of hit on how those all change or what all changes?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in this more complex world where you have like product-led growth motions or self-serve and enterprise, you have hybrid pricing models, or you have pricing models with like 5 or 6 different components, right? It's just more complex to operationalize. So inherently, subscription only, which is the world that we were in, not long ago, is actually just quite a bit more simplistic. Let's say you're a customer success person working on an account for a company that does a subscription. I mean, obviously, you care about how customers are using the product, but you can probably wait until like 6 months before it's time to renew, and then go and reach out and see what's going on. That's just not an option when it comes to a consumption-based pricing model, because you're not going to get paid unless the customer is actively getting value. As a customer success person, you have to know exactly what's going on in the account at all times. And if it's trending below where you expected them to be consuming, you have to reach out and kind of like actually work on that, which I think is I think that's just a better outcome for both the company and its customers, right? It makes for a much more accurate model with respect to the value trade between companies. I would also say, it changes, you mentioned a couple of things there. It changes your accounting, changes your forecasting, it changes your sales motion, it changes how important post-sales is, it changes sales compensation. When you're looking at accounting, now all of a sudden, as opposed to just being able to recognize the revenue in these kind of like straightforward chunks, maybe you're selling a commit model and you have to recognize your revenue as you burn down against the commit. So you literally need to know what the exact fine-grained usage is to be able to recognize revenue properly in a month or in a quarter.
And then the unused that you haven't, spent yet or burned down of those commitments, those are probably going to show up as like deferred revenue on your balance sheet somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just like, most systems are not set up for that. They don't have the data source for it. They don't capture data in that way. If you look at something like forecasting, right? In a subscription-based model, you really only need Salesforce opportunities to understand where your kind of like revenue forecasting is going to be, because like a rep will just call out like, oh, okay, I think this account is going to close for this much or is going to renew for this much.
That's your pipeline. Yeah,
exactly. If you can get that end-to-end pipeline right, then you're probably in like reasonable shape. Now there's the second order problem of like, how do you make sure that this is actually forecastable and accurate? But in a consumption-based model, that's not the only variable anymore. Your revenue is directly tied to how much customers are consuming day in and day out, right? If it's a good quarter for them and their business grows a lot, you might see it go up like this. If it's not so great, then maybe it's a little bit flatter. And so you need access to that information all the time to be able to forecast. If you look at, I think this was like Mike Scarpelli from Snowflake. He wrote a blog post about this. He's the CFO. He mentioned that, at Snowflake, they more or less forecast continuously because you're constantly updating your forecasts based off of what's happening. You look into that forecast and you can just see up to date exactly where you think you're going to hit for the month or for the quarter based off of up to date, real-time consumption data, which is what we offer. Small shout out there. But.
Small plug. Yeah.
Small plug. Yeah. And then, when you think about like the sales motion, right, and sales compensation, most salespeople who haven't sold in a consumption-based model before are used to actually going out there and selling really large commitments up front. They're trying to maximize the size of that initial expand, but that may not be the right motion in a consumption-based model. Oftentimes, it's more correct to go in there and to sell maybe like a small account first, as you mentioned. Like maybe it's that like first couple of working groups at Microsoft, and then you kind of connect them over time and you build that momentum in the account. So if you're not careful with how you do your sales compensation, let's say for instance, you primarily compensate folks on the initial commit size, so just the bookings, as opposed to having any attachment to what happens later on, you can get some really awkward incentives where a customer or a salesperson is really incented to oversell a customer, right? Which is not what you want. That may be net harmful for your business. So you have to adjust your sales comp. You have to change your entire sales motion to kind of match how you're going to do that. And then finally, I mentioned the post-sales thing before, but I would say post-sales becomes roughly, 3 times more important when you're in a consumption-based pricing model. It's just totally different, right? Like it's no longer just about whether or not the customer renews, but as an example, time to value, time to deploy is directly related to the consumption curve of a company. If you get 6 months of extra consumption because you deployed 6 months faster, you're really drastically pulling your revenue forward, right? They're not just paying you kind of this subscription regardless of what happens or not. And so then there are things you can do from a pricing and packaging point of view to really kind of solve for some of these things. Let's say you're a product that has like just a really complex product to deploy. Maybe in year one, you charge, a services or platform fee. The point is that all of these things really are different, right, between kind of like the prior model. And when someone is thinking about how to change their pricing and packaging, they really need to be thinking about how they account for not just like, oh, how am I going to change the spreadsheet, the calculations on the pricing and packaging model, but actually like how every single part of their business changes.
Why was this an interesting startup for you to build in the first place?
I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that it's tremendously impactful to companies, which is something you'll hear about when I go through the founding story. It's actually one of the most important levers a company has to be able to change their market position.
Really? Change their market position?
I'll give you a kind of story from the old days of telco pricing, which is, do you remember family plans where it's like, oh, if you and 3 other members of your family are on the same plan, then when you text each other, when you call each other, the phone minutes or the text messages are free. This is probably like drastically dating myself.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of remember this. Yeah.
Right. This is like back in the dark ages when it cost money to call someone for some number of minutes, and to text someone. Now we just get rate limited based off data because that's the new layer of abstraction. It's still consumption based, but it's all data. Back in the day, you were getting charged for the number of minutes or the number of text messages that you were spending. And I forget who it was. Don't quote me necessarily precisely on this one, but I believe it was T-Mobile that came out with the first ever family plan. There was this concept that if you brought other members of your family onto your phone plan, you could kind of like text and call each other for free. That's really valuable. Like the people that you probably call and text the most are your other family members. When you look at the kind of net effect, that basically gave T-Mobile some like built-in virality and network effect into how customers were actually kind of adopting their phone plans. I believe at the time it was Singular that had kind of like the majority of the market share at the time. They're now a part of AT&T. But when T-Mobile did this, they literally couldn't respond because their billing system didn't have the capacity to be able to make all of these like kind of family plan texts and phone calls free. And so T-Mobile just had like this period of time where it was able to kind of have unfettered access, like unfettered competitive advantage in the market. And why wouldn't people just kind of go and sign up for that product, right? And so that wound up actually like really costing market share for Singular. Setting that story aside for a second, you kind of understand what I mean, which is like if a company goes and decides to do something from a pricing point of view and the competitors can't respond either because of the underlying like product, right? Let's say like Snowflake and the fact that you could elastically like kind of expand or contract the size of your instance, or if you can't respond because your billing system is literally incapable of doing so, that gives a massive competitive advantage, right, to the company that's more flexible there. And there are other examples of this as well that I'll get into a little bit later. But I think that was really the first. I would say also, if I were to think about what personally is interesting to me as a big nerd around billing, it's really kind of this extraordinarily complex, like this instantiation of a company's business model, right? So imagine like trying to write software that can understand the breadth of what 2 people, 2 organizations can negotiate in human language. It's insane. And then you add on the data component of what we do, which is also this incredibly challenging infra and data problem as well. Huge volumes of data. It has to always be correct. It actually ends up being this world-class product design and technical problem. And this was really important to my co-founder, Scott, and I. It felt like an area where you really get rewarded for good execution. So we like complex problems and we like places where we can kind of affect the outcome. And this really felt like one of those. And then finally, I mean, the opportunity is actually just really, really significant. If you look at some of the biggest companies in SaaS software, they were built in the revenue stack, right? So adjacent to or touching revenue in some way. You have Salesforce, which is sitting kind of like at the front end of that, right, with all of the opportunities. You have Stripe as an infrastructure layer underneath. You have at the endpoints, you have SAP with its ERP and Ledger. You have NetSuite and Oracle, right? Like these are some like pretty sizable companies, even like kind of, companies that are slightly smaller, but still very valuable, like Bill.com. It's just a part of the stack that, because it's so directly tied to how companies survive and thrive, gets a lot of attention. What was really strange from my point of view is like you kind of look at the middle of that, which is, I would say, the billing system, the system that's responsible for calculating all of that. And there wasn't some gigantic, obvious world-beating company in the middle, which is obviously the most central and most important part. And so that really felt like an opportunity for us. And I think the reason, frankly, is because billing is really hard for all the reasons that I talked about above. But again, we were looking for something where if we executed well, that reward was really, really great.
Yeah, it's kind of like you solved this, I don't know, contract legal problem. You need to solve the problem of very accurate data to understand what's going on and how to measure the contract. And then there's also, you're like a payment product also. You're all these different things all kind of tied in one.
Yeah. Well, you have to at least integrate with the payment product. So Metronome doesn't force you to use like Metronome payments, but it's actually, and this gets into a lot of the reasons why we built the product the way we did. But it does like interface with that very, very important kind of flow of money. And what I would say, when you look at broadly, like the amount of value that can be created in there, like that really gets into the story of why my co-founder and I actually decided to start the company.
You and Scott, your co-founder, you both sold your first companies to Dropbox, totally different companies. And actually, you said you started this in college, and I think you said you didn't know what you were doing. So I guess question really quick, what were some of the things you learned that first time around, like things you didn't know you were doing?
I think it would have been easier to come up with a list of what I knew, because it was very short. Okay. I mean, just to contextualize this, right? Like, again, this is maybe dating me a little bit, but you're right. I started my first company when I was still in college. Truly had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I'd never even really worked in a professional environment aside from a handful of internships, right? So shout out to my co-founders from my first company, Steven and Marty, for putting up with me. It's just wild in retrospect how little we knew about starting companies. And we still figured it was kind of worth a shot anyway. And again, just to contextualize, back then, seed rounds were very small. They were probably on the order of like 500K. The understanding of SaaS as a space was near zero. And the understanding of even startups as a space was near zero. I mean, to give you some context, like I don't think product market fit was even a phrase back when I started my first company. No, it was all like ramen profitable, like Steve Blank's like 4 steps to the epiphany. It was like a very different set of kind of knowledge and wisdom at the time. YC was like 10 companies. It was just getting started. And so it was really like a totally different frame of reference. You really only started companies if you felt like you could do nothing else, or if you could literally do nothing else. You just had no other options.
No one would hire you.
Yeah, exactly. And so we had gotten into this great summer fellowship program that was put on by Lightspeed Venture Partners. I think it was called the Lightspeed Summer Fellowship. And the requirement for the program was that you had at least one person that was still in school. All 3 of us were still in school. So that's what made us eligible. And we were kind of very relieved that we were going to be able to focus full time on starting a company instead of going and trying to find an internship at Goldman Sachs or whatever it was that would have been the alternative. And so the thing I remember, just to give you a sense of how little we knew, my co-founder on that first company, he had worked briefly at Amazon, and kind of like the idea was that Amazon had all of these really, really exciting and interesting data science tools to help with their kind of like analytics, pricing, and packaging. He kind of came with this idea along with myself and our third co-founder that we should try and develop that tooling and sell it to other businesses, right? It's primarily e-commerce companies, because they were going to need it in order to be able to compete with Amazon. And I remember sitting down with Steven and Marty, and we were kind of like going full steam ahead on this idea. And then I was like, whoa, guys, like, hold on a second. we haven't really done our diligence. We haven't thought about other things that we might build. We're going to work on this for the summer, but maybe this turns into something quite a bit bigger. So we should think a little bit harder. Let's step aside for like 15 minutes and then come back and see if we think of anything else. So we all stepped out. We came back 15 minutes later. No new ideas. Okay, great. Let's do it. Okay. Like that was the entire process.
That was the diligence.
That was the diligence. That was the entire process. Like we really did not know even the basic building blocks of how to do customer research, understanding the buying process and budgeting for purchasing software. We didn't know very much at all. Again, because none of us had ever worked in those environments. And so with Metronome, that diligence process was much deeper, like both on the idea and on each other.
Yeah. How many ideas did you guys come up with?
It was probably on the order of like dozen or so that we seriously considered. And we really went deep on, a handful. There were a lot of spaces that we explored. So the context here, Scott Woody, my now co-founder and the CTO of Metronome, we became really good friends because we both had started companies and sold them to Dropbox. A mutual friend who is now our head of finance at Metronome connected the two of us and said, you're both huge nerds. You're both, recently acquired founders at Dropbox. You're going to get along great. And he was right. And so Scott and I became friends almost immediately after I got to Dropbox. He had been there just a little bit longer than I had. And so he kind of knew a little bit more about what was going on. We kind of knew that we wanted to start a company together, but we didn't know when. And then, eventually, like I left the company, left Dropbox, and we kind of came back and started looking into ideas together over a period of, I want to say like well over a year.
What was the time frame between meeting and then deciding we're starting a company?
Oh, it was a long time. I think so we met in 2014. I left Dropbox in 2016. I was doing some advising and stuff on the side. I wanted to kind of get a little bit more context on other companies. Basically, I'd only ever worked at two. It was just my own startup in Dropbox. And so Dropbox definitely taught a lot with respect to how companies functioned and how to hold a high quality talent bar. But we started Metronome, I think, about 3 years after I left Dropbox, so 2019.
So you had known each other for about 5 years.
Yeah, about 5 years. But for many of those years in between, we'd like kind of just come together, sneak into the Dropbox offices somewhere and go and kind of whiteboard out ideas or something after hours. Or we'd go and kind of like grab lunch outside of work and talk about different things that we could potentially work on together. And so there was definitely a lot of interest, but it was part kind of like timing and part finding the set of things that we were really excited to work on together. And we also because we'd started our first companies already, we really wanted to do that diligence on each other. Like we knew kind of how intense of an experience it was. And that, just because you were friends with someone, that didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be able to work well together. Right. And so I remember one very memorable time we were thinking about doing some sort of idea related to small businesses. I don't even remember what it was at this point. We were just like, small businesses seem like an interesting area. They're underserved, but we don't know anything about small businesses. How do we learn? And I remember this was the moment when I was like, I really think we can work well together, because we decided that to learn about small businesses, we would drive to Milpitas, which is, kind of this more suburban area in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we bought a box of Krispy Kreme donuts, and we decided to go around door to door, knocking on doors, pretending to be Stanford grad students working on some sort of project related to small businesses. And we'd offer people donuts in exchange for doing a user research interview with us. The goal that we set, and this was the thing that I thought was really important, our goal was to get rejected 50 times. So we weren't stopping until people had said no and kind of shut the door in our face 50 times.
Okay. That's actually probably a good idea, because you're probably going to hit that eventually.
Oh, 100%. You're going to hit that eventually. And we got some bites, but I think the important thing in that process was you can kind of go through this pretty uncomfortable, not always the best experience with someone, and to know that you're going to really enjoy it, you're going to get a lot out of it, and that you're aligned on always doing what's best, regardless of how fun or not fun it was. It wasn't fun to get rejected 50 times, although we kind of tried to make it fun. We did a bunch of values diligence on each other. This is something that I always try to advise other founders on when they ask about, how to think about figuring out whether or not the person that they're working with is the right one. Understand what it is about each other that makes you want to work with each other, and see if that aligns you to a core set of values that you can both get behind, that are representative of the type of company that you want to build, among other things. You have to have all the hard discussions, who owns what is your role, as the company evolves. But being able to have those hard conversations and being able to then, when you disagree, figure out a way to work through it, I think was actually pretty critically important. We kind of took our time. It was a better part of a year doing all this diligence on each other. And then we finally ended up on Metronome. Sorry, this was very roundabout, but we got to Metronome because we had looked at all these different spaces that were kind of far afield. And I think it was an important part of the search process. We were just trying to convince ourselves, like, look, we've both been in SaaS our entire careers. Is that like, are we just doing that by default, or do we actually believe that, that's really like the type of company that we want to build? And so we started from what we knew, and that was kind of like the point that unlocked everything. I think we found that when you were trying to get up to speed on new things, it was really hard to just build up the level of conviction that was necessary to go all in on a new idea, especially when you're a second-time founder. I call this second-time founder syndrome, but I'm curious if you've ever seen this with the other folks that you've interviewed. But oftentimes when you like start a first company and then you go and start a second company, you're in the diligence process for the second company trying to solve for every single thing that you were worried about or that you didn't like from the first company, even if it's not possible. And then, what you eventually realize is that that's not feasible. Like, all good ideas have warts. They all look really bad in some kind of way, right? Like, who the hell is going to get into a stranger's car and pay money for it? Or is kind of like the classic example, right? Like,
stay
why
in a
would you do
stranger's
that?
house, Airbnb.
Stay in a yeah. And those are like the classic examples. But even every like SaaS company, you can come up with probably close to a dozen reasons why it won't work. I'm curious if you've seen other founders kind of fall into that trap as well. But it was definitely like, it felt like that for me, because at that point I was almost like 3 years on for my first company, and I was just like finding all these reasons to rule out every single idea that I came across because it didn't quite fit.
I've definitely seen it. And I mean, I see it a lot as investing in startups. Like, it's like, what have I seen people struggle with and fail, like selling to a certain kind of customer, or these sales cycles are really long, or the contracts are never big enough in this certain industry. And it's usually you learn firsthand from some big mistake, like, oh, it's hard to sell to hospitals or something, or the contract, like the ACVs and selling to small businesses, they're never big enough. So you need to make sure your CAC and payback period and like sales velocity is very quick. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I mean, I think it makes sense though, as a second-time founder. It's like, where did you fail the first time? And you're trying to, solve for those risks and de-risk it the second time around. So,
but the secret is there is no way to de-risk everything. And this is actually, I think, the superpower of first-time founders is that they don't have that baggage. I won't go so far as to say as this is, the right solution for everyone. But to me, it was really getting back to fundamentals, right? Getting back to something that we understood really, really well. And that being the thing that kind of put us over the edge. Even though there were a dozen objections as to why Metronome wouldn't be successful as a company, we knew that space well enough to be able to find the through line, the thing that would convince us that this is going to succeed. And so what happened there was really, I think a lot of credit goes to Scott. He had built the growth and monetization engineering team at Dropbox. I'd done some stuff that was kind of tangentially related, right? Like the first company was in analytics and pricing. And so I had some familiarity with it, but I wouldn't have called myself a billing expert to begin with.
Is anyone a billing expert? I don't know. Maybe you are now.
Yeah, I think it kind of requires you to live and marinate in the context for many, many years. It's just, again, it's so complex. But Scott had kind of built this team. It was this really important piece in Dropbox's growth from about 200 million to, I think, like 1.6 billion in ARR. He found over and over again, and I kind of, had seen much of the same, but so many strategic decisions were just gated on the billing system, right? So everything from new product launches to acquiring another company to changing our pricing and packaging, our go-to-market motion to expanding internationally. Like, I remember one very kind of like memorable example. We wanted to expand into Japan, and that was the largest free user base for Dropbox outside of North America. So it made a lot of sense to kind of get a Japanese, let's call it, language website and portal and pricing out into the world. And we found that all of the pricing in our billing system was hard coded. And so there was no way to change the pricing for the Japanese launch, which then actually, ended up delaying the Japanese launch until we had time to refactor the billing code. And that's a hugely impactful thing to delay because of, some sort of like internal systems limitation.
It's the third largest economy in the world, right? Something like that.
Yes. I mean, it's really, really significant. It was a big opportunity and it was something that was important to all the people there at the time. So I think if you look at that set of problems, it was, why in the world could you make a decision to like go and, launch in a new locale or to go and acquire another company and then have that depend on an internal system? And then you have to wait to make that level of strategic decision. Like, it was honestly through no fault of Dropbox's. Dropbox had, built all of this stuff during a time when a lot of it was not well understood. Again, this is like the early days of SaaS. Not even clear that people back then would have categorized Dropbox as a SaaS company as opposed to a consumer company. They had to build their own payment gateway because Stripe didn't exist at that point. I think this is, really consistent thematically with what we hear when we talk to companies, but under no circumstances are you ever resourcing, something like your billing system to the extent where it really needs to be resourced. Like, if you're building this internally, you're telling folks like, hey, I want you to go and like kind of just make this work for the pricing that we need to release. And you can't be the blocker for it. This has to get out the door by like X date. You're never going and being like, here, let's put all of our most senior engineers and architects on this project and have them design a system that can handle all of the pricing and packaging that our company might pivot into over the course of the next 10 years. That's a non-goal. Yeah. But in designing it in this like very rigid, like let's solve for the now kind of way, that means every time you pivot or every time you change something, you now have to go back and spend another sprint, another 5 sprints in order to get, things to a place where you can actually unblock this new set of things. It becomes this like constant drag on the system. And those engineers, like, they're fantastic engineers. There are a lot of stuff they can work on internally on the platform or on the product besides billing. We actually really, I think, started with that and that feeling that like, this goes back to why our mission is to operationalize and accelerate. It's because we were looking at all these decisions and be like, they need to happen faster. Like, they need to happen more quickly, and then they need to come into being more quickly. You have to be able to operationalize these decisions like fast. If you decide to change your pricing and packaging, or if you decide to launch a new product, billing should just never be the long pole. And in fact, billing should try, and that system of record should actually make that decision easier for you, right? It should expose all the data necessary or help you calculate what pricing and packaging might be, right? So you don't have to waste time trying to figure that out. We should be speeding up those decisions whenever possible and helping you operationalize them more quickly.
You want your best people actually building the products, not at the end, like, oh, how do we accept the payment or how do we charge people?
Not because that's not a hard problem or it's not a valuable problem, but because it's the same problem that dozens of other companies have. So why just rebuild the same thing that 24 other companies have already built? What is the value in that?
And so I guess that comes back to one of the questions I had. I think you talked to 60 companies in the course of 6 weeks was when you first kind of, I guess like the sprint you did when you're kind of first doing your diligence and figuring this all out. Can you kind of explain that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was probably one of the biggest learnings. Like, if you compare what we did for need finding for Metronome, and frankly, like all the other stuff that we did before it, but it was really focused and really, really careful relative to the 15 minutes we spent thinking about other ideas, for the first company that I had worked on, right? And so it was this really, really methodical process where the goal was to hit kind of a certain level of volume, but to also keep time to synthesize our learnings each time and to kind of like constantly evolve what we were trying to understand. We talked about 60 companies in 6 weeks. This was really heavily kind of leaning on our network. A big thank you to all the friends who were kind enough to make introductions there. And we had this 2 days on, 1 day off structure where we would interview companies for 2 days along like a certain set of dimensions that we were trying to understand about the space.
Was it all billing? Like, had you guys decided billing was the space?
At that point, we were like, we want to do the need finding process for billing specifically. We hadn't decided we are definitely going to work in billing. I think we were trying to understand the billing space more broadly. Those 60 companies spanned a pretty broad range of sizes and types, all SaaS companies. But we did this like, actually not all SaaS companies. Some of them were in consumer software as well. There were use cases for sure. But it was this very like It was 2 days on, 1 day off. And I think that's actually really important. Too many people get into a rhythm where it's like 5 days on, no days off, where you're just interviewing companies constantly. But you have to take that additional space to take a step back and to think about what it is that you've actually learned in 2 days of talking to companies and what explicit adjustments you want to make to your need finding process. That makes the next 2 days drastically more efficient, right? It makes it much more valuable. And so what we got to, what Scott and I like to refer to it as, was really like kind of like a private glimpse of the future. And
Really?
That's a super important feeling to have for a founder. That's your advantage relative to the market. Like, you put in all that work to get to that. So we kind of felt two things. The first is we were getting dragged kind of like kicking and screaming in the direction of billing, almost like regardless of whether or not we wanted to. Like, people were kind of urging us like, okay, when are you going to build this thing that you're talking about? The other thing was, at the time, consumption-based billing was not really a thing. I mean, there were companies that were on those early consumption models, right? Like, you had like Snowflake and Datadog and Twilio, but it wasn't like a broadly adopted set of paradigms for software. And I remember at the time,
pretty easy too. Like, it's just like a Twilio. It's like an API pull, really easy to track.
Well, I don't think the Twilio team would call it easy. Like, I think at the time we had gotten feedback that Twilio had something like 100 billing engineers, and this might be apocryphal, but I had heard that at some point that grew to 200. So it's not a simple problem what Twilio is dealing with. The pricing and packaging gets very complex, even if the base metric is simplistic.
Even two, though, you're talking about 200 engineers building this in a company Twilio size. Like, you can definitely see the value of just have someone else solve that problem for us.
Dropbox had a team of 70 working on billing, in addition to the team of 70 working on growth and monetization that Scott was working on. Like, that entire monetization team was massive.
And it still took them a long time to open the market, to open Japan.
These were really complicated systems. Like, they required a lot of work, and that grew over time, right? You had to hire the right people. But I think when you look at like those first 60 companies, we really felt like, looking at that set, I mean, I'll just give you the numbers, like probably 10 or 15% of them, so call it like 6 to 8 companies, had a consumption-based pricing model. But I want to say something like 85%, 90% of them had something coming. They were like, I have this product in pipeline that is going to really drastically change how the system functions and we have no idea how we're going to solve for it, or we really need to make this pricing and packaging change, or we need to sell this add-on. If you look outwardly, you're like, oh, this is just 10 to 15% of the market that is seeing their pricing and packaging get complex. And then it wasn't until you dove into it and you actually talked to everyone when you're like, oh, everyone is actually going to have some version of this problem at some point, right?
Yeah.
Like, even if the base pricing model was subscription, there was going to be some kind of add-on or something that they were experimenting with, some change to product-led growth, something was kind of encouraging their pricing to get more complex, and they weren't sure that kind of like the existing systems that they built or that they bought were going to be a good fit for that. So that actually was really, I think, for us, like the learning that we took that eventually led to the seed round.
That was, from what I saw, I think it was like a $5 million seed round from General Catalyst.
And a lot of angels.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of angels. Can you kind of just talk us through that?
Yeah. Our seed round was honestly a bit of a tough process initially, right? So what we thought was really obvious after talking to those 60 companies, I think was not obvious to everyone else. I think a lot of folks were broadly skeptical. They weren't sure whether or not Metronome was going to be a feature, or whether it was really like a kind of paradigm shift for how SaaS companies were doing their pricing. And so we had really kind of two components to the seed round. We had a large group of angels, and then we had Quentin from General Catalyst, who led the round. Shout out to him for believing in us early. With the angels, I remember, really trying to focus on being methodical about the angel investors that we brought on. And we actually try to make angels every single round at Metronome. I found them to be incredibly useful. This is a lot of the same advice that I give to some of the founders that I advise, but trying to find, for example, founders that are 1 or 2 rounds ahead of you, who are going to give you really tactical advice. Like, the truth is, in the early days, the advice that you need is probably less like, oh, how do I tackle this big strategic question? It's more like, which HRIS do I use? Or, how do I find a legal counsel that's not going to cost me an arm and a leg, who's going to help me get, my first, customer MSAs done. Right. So like, having some really tactical on the ground advice from folks is really helpful.
Did you do minimum check size, or are you just like, hey, if you want to give me $1,000, that's totally fine?
We had an interesting strategy. We talked to the angels first. We asked them what their maximum would be. We didn't have a minimum defined at the time. And we just kind of asked them to kind of sign off on whether or not we were interesting as a company. And then that gave us the momentum that we needed to go in and talk to the lead and to get that lead investment figured out. After which point we kind of knew how much allocation we had. And then we kind of like right-sized all the checks. And we tried to take care of the folks who really committed early in the process, right? But I think, the other thing we tried to do was we really wanted to bring on angel investors, founders, and operators who had a lot of credibility just broadly with the problem space. So folks who were founders or executives at early usage-based companies, right? So this would be like William and Zach from Plaid, Calvin French Owen from Segment. There were a lot of folks like that who really, and later on, Armand from HashiCorp, Reynald and Jan from Databricks, really kind of bringing on founders who could tell us their story around what was painful about their experience trying to stand all of this up from scratch. That was super helpful for us. And so being kind of like careful and thoughtful about what areas you might need help in, and thinking tactically is just advice I give to a lot of founders. If you think you are going to need help dealing with people issues, right? Because it's not an area that you're experienced in, but you don't have the capital to bring on a full-time people person early on, then maybe it's a good idea to bring in an angel investor who's familiar with that, who you can rely on for kind of tactical advice, and just make that agreement clear and explicit upfront around like what it is that you expect them to help with. But yeah, we eventually kind of went through that process, got to a bunch of term sheets, and ended up picking Quentin from General Catalyst, who was CTO at Dropbox. Prior to that, CTO at SAP, which was another company in the revenue stack. We felt like that insight would be really broadly useful. And he actually hadn't even started at GC yet. He was kind of like on his way over, like it had been announced, but he hadn't officially hit his start date.
You didn't know if it was going to happen.
But yeah, happening in the background to like make it work. But big shout out to him and for all those early angels for really making it happen and for believing in us early.
Who were some of the like very first people?
I remember the very first check that we got, or that the very first commitment we got, was from a couple of people. So there was Jean Denis, CTO over at Plaid. He was kind of, prior to that, someone we knew from Dropbox. So a lot of folks from the Dropbox network. Nat Turner and Zach Weinberg, who were investors in my very, very first company.
Wow, they came back.
They came back despite having invested in someone who literally had no idea what they were doing the first time around. They were somehow convinced to come back. So big thank you to Nat and Zach for being amenable to that. But yeah, I mean, it's something you learn throughout your career. Is a lot of the people who kind of help you along the way are the folks that you've built up relationships with over time. Silicon Valley is not a very big place. And even like kind of the broader tech ecosystem is not a very big place. And so if you take care of people, if you do right by them, they'll come back to back you a second time or a third time when you go and take that next risk.
So raise the seed round. I think you had mentioned something about you were like signing deals with customers before you had a product. Is that like, how should I think about that as a startup founder?
A surprising number of founders do that. The first thing is to take a step back and to realize that people buy software because of trust, right? Like this is broadly true regardless of what stage you're in. And all of the other process things that, companies do are just exercises to help establish that trust. So RFPs, POCs, customer references, all of those are just a means to the same end, which is I trust you and I'm going to buy your software. The bad news is when you're an early stage startup with no customers, trust is in very short supply, right? So you don't have customers that can vouch for your product working or how good your team is, and you may not even have a product that you can demo, which is the case with us. The good news is that when someone's pain is acute enough, they're more willing to take a bet, right? They're more willing to take more risk in order to solve their pain. And that's why, for me at least, early stage sales is really an exercise in just two things. One is finding the pain, right? So that's figuring out who is feeling the most pain around your market and your problem space. This is basically the search process for getting to product market fit. And I mentioned this before, but you'll know it when you feel it. When the pain is strong enough, it almost is like a gravitational pull.
Like people want to pay you.
Exactly. Like whether or not you like it, you're going to get dragged along. And then I think the second thing is establishing trust, right? And you don't have much on which to establish trust in the beginning. You have to think about what you do have. So maybe it's expertise in the problem space. maybe it's a set of great design mocks, or maybe it's early funding from a top tier set of investors. You need something like a seed that you can germinate into that trust with the customer. And so at Metronome, we really early on sold on just two things: our own expertise and some white papers, basically like a set of architecture diagrams and design principles. Like we didn't even have a demo for the very first set of customers because we hadn't built the product yet. And we just were fortunate to have found a space where customers were feeling real pain and to have worked with early customers that believed in us enough and were willing to take a bet, right? And so the thing that this is again, very common advice that I give to founders, but I really, really urge founders to take a step back and to consider whether or not the right thing to do is actually to go and build. If that makes sense. I would say it's typically very common for folks to overbuild, right? Like it's very common for a founder to like think, hey, if I just build this out a little bit more, it'll resonate more in the demo and that'll get us to product market fit. And in reality, there are a lot of ways for you to figure that out or to get to that first set of customers that don't involve building the product. You can go and iterate on this thing in design. You can bring those design mocks to folks. That's much faster and it gives you a much quicker kind of iteration cycle than trying to go and actually build and rebuild the product 7 times as you're trying to find product market fit. And so figuring out the ways in which you can speed up that cycle and getting to that first set of customers that says, I care about this enough, like this makes sense, I think is really helpful. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a good thing to build a demo. Some things really have to be felt or seen to really kind of grok. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily the first thing that you should reach for, in my opinion.
You've said something interesting related to sort of customer trust. You mentioned as OpenAI was scaling, I think they're one of your public customers. I think that's on the website. You mentioned not caring what your costs were to serve and just giving them a good experience. Why did you do that? I mean, maybe it's straightforward, but that's pretty bold to just not care about yourself.
As you might imagine, when OpenAI started really hitting, their insane product market fit, the just sheer data volumes that they were sending to us started increasing drastically. And so that obviously, that cost us a lot. I made it super clear, and we talked about this as a company, that our effort and energy was not going to go towards like going and distracting them at such a critical time with like, oh, now you need to go and pay us more. And instead to focus on doing everything we could to scale with them and to keep up and to make sure like they had continuity of business and they weren't kind of suffering. I think it really goes back to one of our core values, which is being customer obsessed. I think in the long run, you build up trust with customers by repeatedly and consistently delivering with those customers over and over and over again. And, sure enough, like later on when we went and retroed all of this with them, they told us how appreciative they were and the fact that they kind of noticed that, we were one of the few vendors that didn't come out to them with arms outstretched being like, hey, where's the additional money? And they saw that, when other vendors were hitting like major scaling problems, like we certainly hit scaling problems too. I think everybody did, but how focused we were on working through it with them. And that ultimately led to a much better, stronger long-term relationship. I think, again, Silicon Valley, the tech ecosystem, very small place. You want to do right by customers whenever you can. And of course, like you have to have that level of trust established, right? Like you don't want to just give things away for free forever. But if you have that trust established and you have that right level of partnership, I think in the long run, it's better for everyone.
And then what time period was that? Just curious.
I can't remember the exact months, but it coincided with the release of ChatGPT, as you might expect. Literally like the data that was being sent over to Metronome increased by like multiple orders of magnitude in just the span of like 2 months. The OpenAI side of things just like drastically increased. And that obviously was also just like a huge amount of data net. And so there's some stuff out there, I think, stories of what other vendors were feeling at the time. And I think it was really, really hard to keep up for anyone. I think it was, the fastest scaling SaaS business of all time. So
yeah, or like consumer business also, just like 0 to 100 million, whatever. I don't know, it was like a month or something, whatever their official records say. And then I think you were probably in a position to absorb because you had just sort of, I don't know, a couple months or a year before that raised a Series A, right? So you had a little bit of a balance sheet to kind of shock absorb the costs. Okay. Yeah. And that was a $30 million Series A from A16Z.
Martin Casado. Yeah. at Andreessen. Yeah, he's their GP who leads their infrastructure team. We wanted that context because for us, like the data volumes were increasing and Metronome's architecture was getting kind of increasingly complex. So yeah, the Series A was a really interesting process for us. I would say, in contrast to the seed round, people kind of got it much more quickly. We had the metrics to back up the story. It wasn't just, two guys with a slide deck and nothing else.
Hypothesis from some customer conversations.
Exactly. And so the Series A was a hugely competitive and frankly stressful process.
Stressful, really? Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think if you talk to any founder about what fundraising is like, even the ones who do it all the time and are good at it, they'll tell you that it's stressful. I mean, it's emotionally taxing. It's a really consequential decision, right? Like, and at the Series A, we were thinking about bringing on a board member for the first time in the history of the company. And the way I think about board members is they're like executives, except you can't fire them. So you better do everything you can to make sure that you pick the right person. And so we had looked at a whole set of criteria. I'm not going to go all the way into it.
So what were the biggest ones?
Oh, I mean, I think specifically for the partner, we cared a lot about partner quality. I think we probably did something like 30 reference calls on Martin and Andreessen Horowitz.
Wow. Okay. That's more than I've ever heard.
We probably did over 20 on every single other, each other firm that we were thinking about working with. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's like, what is more consequential than this decision when you're at the Series A? Like, I think of it as a really important long-term partnership. And I'm very happy about the outcome. Martin has been a wonderful partner to us. And I think it's in part because we had that level of conviction, even though it was a fast moving process. But we were looking at everything from what did the firm bring to the table, to the partner standing within the firm, to the a specific type of expertise. That infra expertise was really, really important, to the customers that they could bring to the table, to how they reacted with founders when, maybe the going wasn't so great. Really, really important. If you just talk to someone's references and they bring you a bunch of success stories, you're probably not hearing the whole story of what it's like working with them. So we were very, very careful to kind of go through that entire process. I would say that was the big takeaway and the big difference for us with that Series A, was really thinking about who we were bringing onto the board and what type of board it was that we wanted to build. So.
And then you have a really interesting, I guess, philosophy with hiring, and it's not really that controversial. It's just, you said you just spend a ton of time and you put a ton of resources into finding the right and the best people. Can you just kind of talk about your philosophy and process for doing that?
Yeah. And so this goes back to one of the things that I'm actively doing very differently with Metronome now than with my first startup, right? Mm-hmm. Again, back then we had no idea what good hiring practices were. We just kind of derived it from first principles and crossed our fingers. So I had no idea. You're just making stuff up. And so I think this is broadly true oftentimes of first-time founders, but you're probably overly focused on doing everything yourself. And there is a lot that you have to do yourself. Absolutely no question. There's stuff that you just absolutely have to do and you don't have an option. But with Metronome, we've always placed as much energy as possible since the beginning towards finding and hiring who we thought were the right people. Right. And that started with the values alignment with Scott at the very beginning and identifying the company values early, because that I think is a really, really important part of it. Incorporating that in the interview process and being explicit about how they instantiate, figuring out the bar that we wanted, figuring out, what trade-offs we wanted to make. Right. Oftentimes, you might be able to get that person who's really, really experienced at a large company, but maybe they lose out on a little bit of the small startup scrappiness. Right. Oftentimes you might be able to get that person who comes with a great deal of experience, but maybe they're, not as aligned on the compensation. Maybe they need or want more compensation, or maybe they don't value the equity as much. So ultimately every decision tells you kind of what it is that you're filtering for and what you care about. So it's very, very consequential. My favorite question, or the thing that I like to do for every single person that we hire today, I'm not going to give away everything that we filter for, but I like to go through their resume and ask questions about why they took which roles, which places they felt they were the most and least successful, and why they decided to make changes in their career when they did. It's intentionally open-ended, but it tells you a lot about someone's intentionality. How much are they just making knee-jerk decisions versus doing things intentionally or making career decisions intentionally? What they're solving for in their career, their level of self-awareness. Ultimately, every person in every company is pretty different, right? And so just because someone was successful at one company doesn't mean that they're going to be successful at Metronome. And just because someone wasn't successful at one company doesn't mean they're not going to be successful at Metronome. And so I want to make sure that Metronome is a great fit for anyone we bring on board. So I try to understand them and their decision making, what they are trying to solve for as deeply as possible. And so that's been a really, really helpful addition to the interview process.
How do you think broadly about managing your time as a startup founder? And this is a question from Dmitry Dadimov at Modern Treasury. I had to fit his question in because he introduced us. And thank you to Dmitry for connecting us.
Thanks, Dmitry.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's something I'm still working at. It's probably not the thing that I'm best at. What I would say is, for better or for worse, I am a highly urgent individual. And so when I see something that needs fixing, or if I see something that I want to get better, the urgency level for me is very, very high, like almost like to a fault. It's not always distinguished. But what has helped is taking a step back with Scott and always aligning on what we think the most important, like being brutally honest about, if we strip away like every single other thing that we're doing and we're left with only accomplishing one thing in this next period of time, next month, next quarter, whatever it is, what is that one thing? And trying to focus as much of that urgency and intensity towards that one thing as possible. So that might be finding your first set of customers. That might be figuring out how to make sure that your first set of customers deploys really well. That might be figuring out how you want to make drastic changes to your product and your data model for this like new segment that you're going into, right? Like we recently, I would say about a year ago, started really seeing success selling into the enterprise. We recently announced NVIDIA as a Metronome customer. That requires a lot of intensity and focus on the product. We have a lot of mid-market and startup customers as well. And, luckily we've raised quite a lot of capital. We've been able to grow the company quite a bit. And so that's not, it's not as much of a problem to make sure that we can support them. But that's really, really important for us to like find that set of things that we need to focus on at any given point.
If I'm a founder trying to figure out my pricing model, what's usually the journey look like? What do you usually tell founders to explore?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really important to understand is your initial pricing and packaging model is likely to change a lot, right? Very, very frequently, it's going to change a ton, and it's going to change often. Because when you first start out, you have very little of the customer feedback that's going to help shape the pricing model later on. And so I broadly have kind of 3 points of advice for folks. I find that most commonly, if someone is screwing something up, it falls into one of these categories. So I try to give kind of like this set of advice and make sure that they're doing at least the base set of things right. Okay. I think the first is looking at your comps. So pricing and packaging is contextual. You're always going to be compared to something, right? Direct competitors, better established companies in adjacent industries. How much comparison is usually dependent on industry maturity and what other products your buyer is familiar with, but your packaging and your pricing has to be compelling given that comparison, and it can't be too divergent from market norms, or else a customer is going to look at that and get kind of like this weird feeling that it doesn't align with what everyone else is doing. The second is building for change. I think this is actually a really common mistake. Folks will oftentimes overbuild when they're really, really early stage, or they'll build on something that's like really rigid. They might like custom engineer their first billing system, but because you're frequently iterating on pricing and packaging, it takes time and effort to converge on the right mix. So custom or like bad billing setups actually inhibit your iteration, which is actually the most important thing you have, right? Being able to iterate quickly on your pricing and packaging, because you're actually having to put in more engineering work every time you make a pricing change, or every time an enterprise customer comes to you and is like, hey, I'll sign and I'll give you that 7-figure contract, but I don't like your metrics and I don't like how your pricing structure works, and we're going to rewrite the entire thing. And you're like, oh shoot, how do I do that? I guess it's, we're going to use a spreadsheet, right? Yeah. So making sure that that change is going to happen, that you build for that in advance is really important. And then finally, just making it understandable. So it's really easy to come up with a list of 100 things you want your pricing and packaging to optimize for. Oh, I need it to be a smooth on-ramp into my product, and I want to make sure that it encourages an upsell at this point and all that kind of stuff. But it's much harder to pare that down to the handful that you actually need. So the most common mistake that we see companies making is actually just releasing pricing and packaging that's too complex and having to roll it all the way back because the customer doesn't understand it. Like everyone feels like their product is new and different from the market, right? That's why they're building it. And so they're like, well, because it's new, I can do all these things differently. But it turns out that people don't really want, pricing and packaging to be the thing where you innovate or to be the area where you are kind of like increasing or amping up the complexity because it's hard to understand.
Figure out how you can go fast and lightweight and just keep it simple.
Yeah, keep it simple and understand your comps. Again, so even if it's not a direct competitor, there might be better established companies in adjacent industries, right? Or that your buyer also buys from. So let's say you sell into, an engineering buyer, maybe they're familiar with observability pricing and you're not an observability company, but they're going to be like, well, why don't you price like observability companies? This oftentimes happens if you're doing like net new category creation.
So specifically in net new category creation, it's probably like essential to give them some kind of anchoring, just like an anchor point or a comp to just make it a little bit easier to get over that hump of entirely new product, entirely new category, but at least something about it is familiar.
Yeah, I think that's right. They have to have something on which to base their understanding of why you're doing what you're doing.
Interesting. And then how easy is it to use Metronome? Like when you're talking about, how complicated all this stuff is, really quick, just pitch for like, how do you actually use it? Is it like API, line of code? Do you get a dashboard? How does it work?
It's not quite API line of code, but we've done a lot to try and make it as simple as possible from like an initial setup and integration point of view. We actually have a lot of early stage companies that get set up over the course of a weekend on Metronome. So they'll have a couple of engineers go and get integrated, set up their new pricing and packaging in just a couple of days, maybe a week. That gets harder, to be perfectly honest, as your company gets bigger. There's more stuff you have to migrate, there's change management, there's workflows that you have to change. So that's not going to be the case for like a large enterprise, right? But the key thing that's different is, we try to abstract all of that away, all of the engineering work down to send your data to our API endpoint, send your data to Metronome, right? And then once we have that data, someone non-technical should be able to take over and configure everything from there, configure the pricing and packaging. So it's not gated on doing a bunch of custom engineering work.
Okay, which I think is like probably music to most people's ears.
I mean, most people are not used to having to, or not used to being able to make those changes without having to go and write a bunch of custom code.
This is awesome. Thanks for taking the time. This is a lot of fun. Thank you for listening to this conversation with Kevin at Metronome. If you want to support the show, share this with a founder who has not yet switched to usage-based pricing. You can also like, subscribe, comment, retweet, leave a review, or name your most expensive pricing tier after me. Make sure to check out Artie if you want to operationalize your data. And thanks again to Kevin for coming on and to you for tuning in. See you in the next episode.